The chandeliers at the Briarwood Estate glowed like captured fireflies against the dark walnut beams, their light pooling in warm gold over the long tables, dressed in crisp white linen and towering hydrangea arrangements. And as I stood at the edge of the polished oak dance floor in my midnight blue gown, the one Daniel swore made me look like the first night we met. I tried to ignore the knot in my stomach and the way his eyes kept drifting to the far side of the room where Madison Lane stood laughing with a cluster of board members, her silver dress catching the light like a lure. 200 guests had gathered under this vaulted ceiling to celebrate 20 years of marriage that, to everyone else, still looked like a southern fairy tale. But, to me, had begun to feel like a story I was no longer writing. My son Evan adjusted his tie nervously beside me. My daughter Sophie clutched my hand a little tighter than usual. And somewhere deep down, I already knew tonight wasn't going to end the way I had planned. Daniel was in his element, moving through the crowd with that easy, practiced charm that had won me over in my 20s, smiling at donors, clapping backs, the kind of man who looked born to belong in rooms like this. But I had seen his late-night texts, the sudden gym membership, the way he came home smelling faintly of a perfume I didn't own. What I didn't expect, what I couldn't imagine, was how one small decision tonight would lead to a chain of events that would burn our life down to its foundation. Before I take you back to the start, to the moment I first realized my marriage was cracking at the seams, I want to know something from you. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? I read every single comment, and it still amazes me how many different corners of the globe our stories reach. And if you've just found this channel, welcome. If you love true stories of resilience, justice, and the kind of comebacks you never see coming, hit that subscribe button and join our growing family here. Because what happened to me in the weeks before this night is the kind of thing you think only happens in movies, until it's your hand that's trembling, your kids that are watching, and your whole life balancing on whether you break or fight. It started 3 weeks before the gala, on an ordinary Thursday that didn't feel important until it wouldn't stop replaying in my mind later. I had left school early after covering for another counselor who had to rush her daughter to urgent care. And when I walked past Daniel's home office, I noticed his laptop was still open, humming softly. He'd been leaving earlier for breakfast meetings, and coming home later, his tie loose and his stories vague. And I told myself not to snoop, that I'd regret crossing that line. But then my eyes caught the corner of a printed receipt sticking out from under a file folder. Not from a local coffee shop, but from the Cypress House Inn, a boutique hotel in Raleigh we'd never stayed at. The kind of place couples book for weekend getaways. The date was last Friday night, the same evening Daniel had claimed to be at a board dinner in Charlotte. 2 entrees, a bottle of wine, and a room charge. I remember sitting down in his leather chair, feeling the cold press of the receipt in my hand, like it might burn me, and staring at the familiar way he'd signed the check, neat and slanted, as if that made the lie more believable. I didn't confront him, not then. I folded the receipt into my jacket pocket and drove straight to my sister Jenna's apartment, hoping she'd tell me I was overreacting, that there was some charitable event I'd forgotten he had attended. Instead, she just looked at me with that steady, almost dangerous calm she gets when she's sure I'm in trouble. "Rach," she said, "you don't find receipts like this by accident, and you already know who was sitting across from him. I wanted to deny it, to insist Madison wouldn't do that to me. Not the same Madison who helped me choose my wedding dress, who sat on my porch crying after her second divorce, swearing she was done with men like Daniel. But the truth was already taking root in my gut, and once it started, there was no pulling it back out. For the next 2 weeks, I went through the motions. Meetings at school, Sophie's piano recital, Evan's basketball game, while Daniel floated in and out of the house like a man rehearsing for a part only he knew the lines to. Madison stopped returning my calls, but she liked a post of mine on Facebook about the upcoming gala, which almost made it worse. Like she was saying, "See you there." The night of the event arrived heavy and humid, cicadas singing outside the estate's old stone walls, the air-conditioned rooms inside buzzing with conversation and clinking glasses. Daniel was magnetic, shaking hands, laughing loudly, and for a moment, I let myself believe I'd been wrong, that the receipt meant nothing. Then, in the middle of dinner, he stood, tapped his glass with the back of a silver spoon, and asked for everyone's attention. My first thought was that he was about to thank me for organizing the night, maybe even surprise me with a gift, the way he used to. But as he walked past our table without looking at me, the sound of my own heartbeat drowned out the polite applause. He crossed the room to Madison, who stood with a practiced expression of shock, and the instant his hand reached into his jacket, I understood. He dropped to one knee, the room falling silent so fast I could hear Sophie's chair scrape against the floor. "You've been my closest friend, my anchor," Daniel said to her, "and I can't imagine the rest of my life without you." There was no mistaking his voice, or the way Madison's eyes darted toward me just before she whispered, "Yes," her mouth curving into the kind of smile that makes you want to shatter glass. I felt Sophie's hand slip out of mine, saw Evan's jaw tighten, and all I could think was, they planned this. Not just the proposal, but the exact way it would break me. In public, in front of my children, in the middle of a night I had built for them. And somehow, through the roaring in my ears, I knew I couldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart. Not yet. I didn't sleep the night of the gala, not because I was crying, but because every time I closed my eyes, I replayed Madison's smile, Daniel's voice, the hush of the room when they thought they were watching the beginning of some grand love story. By dawn, I wasn't thinking about saving my marriage anymore. I was thinking about saving my children from growing up believing this was how you treated family. The house was still dark when I padded into Daniel's office, the smell of his cologne lingering in the air like a bad memory, and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for until I found it. His smartwatch charger tangled with old receipts and a spiral-bound notebook full of dates and initials that didn't match any case files he'd mentioned. I took photos of everything, my hands steady in a way they hadn't been in weeks. If he wanted to play this game, I was going to learn the rules, and then rewrite them. The next call I made was to Jenna. She answered on the second ring, her voice low, like she'd been expecting this moment. "I'm done waiting for him to do the right thing," I told her, and she didn't even ask if I was sure. Instead, she said, "Then you need someone who knows how to make people like Daniel wish they'd stayed quiet." That's how I met Paige Armstrong, a friend of Jenna's from law school, now one of the sharpest divorce and family attorneys in the state. We met in a corner booth of a diner halfway between Willow Springs and Raleigh, a place that smelled like coffee and fried eggs and didn't ask questions. Paige was younger than I expected, with quick eyes and a habit of letting silences hang just long enough for you to fill them with the truth. I laid out everything: the receipt from the inn, Madison's sudden disappearance from my life, the public proposal, and waited for her to tell me to brace for an ugly, drawn-out fight. Instead, she smiled like she'd just spotted a shortcut on a map. "You're lucky," she said, leaning in. "Your husband's biggest weakness is that he thinks he's untouchable. That makes him careless, and careless men leave trails." Paige's first question wasn't about assets or custody. It was, "What's the family trust situation?" When I told her about Caroline Mercer, Daniel's estranged mother who'd cut ties over differences years ago, Paige's eyebrows lifted. "She still controls the Mercer estate," Paige said. "And if what you're telling me is true, she'd have grounds to disinherit him under most moral clauses I've seen." My stomach tightened. I'd only met Caroline twice, both times under polite but icy circumstances, and she'd never hidden her belief that Daniel had married beneath his potential. The thought of walking into her world again made my skin prickle. But I knew Paige was right. If Caroline saw Daniel's betrayal as a threat to the family's reputation, she wouldn't just side with me. She'd make him pay in ways I couldn't. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after the kids had gone to bed, scrolling through old holiday photos where Caroline stood stiffly at the edge of the frame, her smile thin but her eyes sharp. She might not like me, but she loved her image, and Daniel had just given me the kind of ammunition that could blast a hole through it if mishandled. I thought about Sophie asking me if I was okay, about Evan pretending not to care, but clenching his fists under the table. I couldn't let this become their normal. Somewhere between the clink of the ice in my glass and the creak of the old floorboards under my chair, my anger crystallized into something cold and deliberate. A plan. I would walk into Caroline Mercer's world, not as the daughter-in-law she dismissed, but as the mother of her only grandchildren, and the one person who could decide whether Daniel's betrayal stayed a private wound or became a public scandal. 2 days later, I found myself standing in front of Caroline Mercer's wrought iron gates, my palms damp on the steering wheel, staring up at the sprawling Georgian-style mansion that looked like it had been plucked straight from a magazine cover. The intercom crackled after I pressed the button, and when I announced myself, there was a long pause before a clipped male voice said, "One moment, please." I could almost hear Caroline deciding whether I was worth her time. When the gates finally swung open with mechanical precision, I drove the winding driveway under towering oaks until the house rose into full view, symmetrical, elegant, intimidating. Caroline greeted me at the door herself, wearing a charcoal sweater set and a string of pearls so perfectly round they might have been chosen with a ruler. Her eyes swept over me like she was taking inventory. "Rachel," she said, her voice polite but cool, "this is unexpected." In her study, surrounded by shelves of leather-bound books and perfectly arranged photographs of Mercer charity galas, I laid out everything I'd found: the inn receipt, the suspicious transactions, the public proposal to Madison. Caroline listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "If you came here expecting me to take sides in a marital spat, "You've wasted your trip," she said. The word stung, but I kept my voice steady. "This isn't just a marriage problem. It's a reputational problem. Daniel's not just humiliating me. He's dragging your grandchildren into a scandal they don't deserve." Caroline's gaze sharpened, but she still didn't commit. "Come back when you have something that won't crumble under his denial," she said finally. "Until then, I won't move." Driving home, I wanted to scream. I had hoped for an instant alliance, for Caroline to recognize the threat and step in. But she'd just told me to go gather more ammunition. Meanwhile, Daniel was moving fast. That week, I got a notice from the bank about a change in our joint account. His name had been shifted to primary, mine to secondary. He'd also suggested that Evan consider a private sports academy in another county, framing it as an opportunity when I could see it for what it was: a wedge to keep the kids aligned with him. At dinner, Sophie pushed peas around her plate, avoiding my eyes, and Evan answered in one-word sentences. The air in our home had gone stale, like everyone was holding their breath. Jenna tried to convince me to confront him right away, to demand answers before he took more control. But Paige reminded me that premature moves could backfire. "You need him to believe you're still the same Rachel, who doesn't suspect a thing," she said over the phone. "That's when people like Daniel get sloppy." Holding my tongue while he played the part of devoted husband in public and schemer in private was harder than I'd imagined. Every time he kissed my cheek before heading to another meeting, I had to fight the urge to wipe it away. But late one night, after he'd gone to bed, I sat at my laptop scrolling through his recent email log, not the content, just the metadata, and saw something that made me sit up straight. 3 separate exchanges with a financial advisor I'd never heard of, all marked urgent. If Caroline wanted more, I was going to give her something that would be impossible to ignore. The next morning, with Daniel already gone for breakfast with a potential investor, I sat at the kitchen table piecing together what those urgent emails meant. A quick online search of the advisor's name pulled up a boutique wealth management firm in Charlotte specializing in discrete asset transfers. By the time Jenna came over with coffee, I had the phone pressed between my ear and shoulder, posing as a potential client while scrolling their Meet Our Team page. The man on the other end was polite, but careless. And in the span of 5 minutes, he'd confirmed that Daniel had been in touch about moving liquid assets into a joint venture account. When I asked who the joint partner was, he hesitated just long enough for me to know. I'd hit the nerve. Madison. I drove straight to Caroline's estate with a folder full of printed emails, bank transaction summaries, and the timeline of their relationship that Paige had helped me compile. This time, when the butler opened the door, Caroline was already standing in the foyer, as if she'd been expecting me. In her study, I laid out the new evidence, watching her face change from calculated neutrality to something colder, more decisive. "He's not just reckless," she said, closing the folder. "He's sloppy. And he's about to learn what that costs." She picked up the phone, her voice shifting into the brisk, commanding tone of someone used to being obeyed, and, within minutes, had her legal team on speaker, instructing them to prepare the necessary amendments to the Mercer Family Trust. When she hung up, she turned to me. "We'll do this my way," she said. "You keep your composure. Let him think the gala is still his stage, and then we'll take it from him." 2 weeks later, The annual Mercer Foundation Gala filled the grand ballroom of the Hawthorne Hotel, all marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and 100 conversations humming under the music of a string quartet. I wore a deep green dress I'd chosen deliberately, not to outshine Madison, but to look like someone who was impossible to overlook. Daniel worked the room, Madison on his arm, both of them glowing with the smug anticipation of people who thought they'd already won. At 9 o'clock sharp, the MC announced Daniel would be making a very special statement, and I felt the air in the room shift. He walked up to the podium, Madison lingering nearby, with her hand resting just enough on his back to make sure I saw it, and began talking about new beginnings and finding the person who truly understands you. That's when the lights dimmed. The quartet's music stopped mid-note and a large screen at the back of the stage flickered to life. At first, there was only silence. Then the unmistakable sight of Daniel and Madison walking into the Cypress House Inn. Time-stamped, dated, and followed by a split screen of bank statements showing withdrawals and transfers into the joint venture account. A murmur rippled through the crowd, growing louder with each passing second. Madison's smile faltered. Daniel's grip on the podium tightened, and then Caroline stepped out from the side stage, her presence like a blade cutting through the noise. "For those of you wondering," she said, her voice carrying easily without a microphone, "this is the kind of conduct that costs you a legacy." She turned toward Daniel, handing a sealed envelope to the MC. "As of tonight, the Mercer Family Trust no longer lists you as its primary beneficiary. All benefits now pass directly to your children, managed by their mother until they come of age." Gasps erupted around us, flashes from phones and cameras catching every second. Daniel's face drained of color, and Madison took a half step back as if she could distance herself from the wreckage. Caroline wasn't finished. "And," she added, "I believe law enforcement has a few questions about those transactions." Two suited officers stepped forward from the back, the sound of their shoes on marble almost louder than the whispers. Madison's voice broke into a shrill, "This is a setup!" But no one moved to defend her. I didn't say a word until Caroline turned to me and nodded, an unspoken signal that the stage was mine. I stepped forward, meeting Daniel's eyes, and said, "The difference between us is simple. I protect our children, you gamble with them, and you just lost." The applause didn't start immediately. It didn't need to. The silence that followed was its own kind of victory, the kind that lands deep and stays there. The night of the gala ended not with music or dancing, but with the muted sound of guests shuffling toward the exits, heads bent together in hurried whispers, their expressions a mix of disbelief and curiosity. The officers walked Madison out through the service hallway to avoid the photographers gathered in the lobby, though a few still caught the flash of her silver dress and the stiff set of her jaw. Daniel didn't try to follow her. He stood frozen by the podium, one hand still on the wood, as if letting go would make the whole scene real. Caroline kept her distance from him, speaking instead with the event manager, her tone brisk, already pivoting to how the foundation would frame the scandal in tomorrow's press release. I slipped away without a word, my heels echoing in the corridor, and by the time I reached the valet stand, the humid night air felt like the first deep breath I'd taken in months. The next morning, the story was everywhere. Local news, gossip blogs, even a short segment on a regional morning show. Mercer, heir, disinherited amid fraud allegations. Reporters camped outside Daniel's downtown law firm, and, by noon, a partner had released a statement announcing his temporary leave pending review. By the end of the week, that leave had become a permanent separation, his name scrubbed from the firm's website. Madison was formally charged with fraud and identity theft, the DA citing the bank records and the trust withdrawals as part of a scheme to unlawfully benefit from funds not her own. Her mugshot, eyes puffy, makeup smeared, was the last image of her anyone saw for months. For the kids, the shift was confusing. Evan tried to hide that he was reading the headlines on his phone, but I saw him scrolling at the kitchen counter, jaw tight. Sophie asked if her friends would see the news and what she should say if they asked about it. I told them both the truth, not every detail, but enough for them to understand that their father had made choices that had consequences, and those consequences had nothing to do with how much he loved them. Caroline invited us to spend a few weeks at her lakeside property, far from the swarm of attention in town. The house was big, but quiet. The kind of place where you could hear the wind move through the trees at night and watch herons skim the water at sunrise, living under the same roof as Caroline was. Surprising. She was still precise in her routines, still exacting in her expectations, but she was also attentive in ways I hadn't seen before. Making Sophie cocoa after a bad dream, listening to Evan explain his basketball stats like it was a board meeting. "They're good kids," she said to me one evening on the porch, handing me a glass of sweet tea. "And you're a good mother. Don't let him make you doubt that." It wasn't affection exactly, but it was something like respect. And it mattered. Daniel's first supervised visit with the kids happened a month later in a neutral space arranged by the court. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in the way he carried himself. The sharpness in his voice was gone. He asked about school and sports like a man trying to remember the language of his own family. I didn't stay in the room, but when it was over, Evan walked out first, his face unreadable, Sophie trailing behind with her hand looped through his arm. They didn't say much on the ride back, and I didn't press. Healing wasn't going to happen overnight. But at least now, the path was ours to choose. 6 months after the gala, the headlines had moved on. The photographers stopped waiting outside the grocery store, and our lives had settled into something new. Not the same as before, but something better in ways I hadn't expected. The kids and I stayed in the lakeside house longer than planned, and when Caroline offered to help me buy a place of my own nearby, I said yes. It wasn't a mansion or an estate, just a 2-story craftsman with a wraparound porch, sunlight in every room, and enough space for Evan's basketball hoop and Sophie's garden boxes. For the first time in years, the walls felt like they belonged to us. I'd gone back to work at the high school, but not full-time. Instead, with Caroline's encouragement and the foundation's backing, I'd started a small nonprofit called The Second Step, dedicated to helping single parents navigate custody battles, asset protection, and the emotional freefall that comes with sudden betrayal. At first, it was just me and a borrowed office space above a cafe, but word spread quickly. By spring, we had volunteer attorneys, counselors, and a list of clients long enough to remind me every day why this work mattered. The stories they brought in weren't so different from mine. Different names, different betrayals, but the same hollowed-out feeling, the same question. How do I start over? Daniel still had supervised visitation twice a month. He was quieter now, careful with his words around the kids, and though I could see the regret in his eyes, it wasn't my job to make it easier for him. Madison had taken a plea deal, serving time and paying restitution. I didn't follow the details closely. I didn't need to. The chapter with both of them in it was over. One evening in early summer, the kids and I were out on the porch watching the sun drop behind the lake when Sophie leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "I like this life better." I asked her why, and she thought for a moment before answering. "Because you're happy. Like, not pretending happy. Actually happy." Evan didn't say anything, but I saw him nod out of the corner of my eye. I didn't tell them that their words meant more to me than any courtroom victory or trust fund could. I just put my arms around them and let the quiet settle in. If you're watching this because you've been where I was, blindsided, humiliated, convinced your life has been reduced to rubble, I want you to hear me when I say this. You are more than what they did to you. The person who betrayed you doesn't get to define you, and the life you thought was over can become the start of something far stronger than you imagined. I used to think my story ended the night Daniel proposed to Madison in front of the world. Now I know it began there, because that was the night I stopped living in someone else's shadow and started building a life worth claiming as my own. The truth is, peace doesn't mean going back to the way things were. It means finally feeling at home in the way things are and knowing you fought for it.